The camera would begin in silence, so complete it presses against the chest. Then, a flicker of lantern light illuminating a blood-stained dictionary left open on a desk. Pages twitch as though from some unseen breath. A voice asks, can a man change the world with his mind, while tearing it apart with his hands? Edward Rulloff was, by all accounts, a genius, a self-taught linguist in an age when most men could barely write their own names. But genius is rarely innocent. By the time he was executed in 1871, he had been called the most remarkable criminal of the 19th century. What history never told you, what was erased, is that Rulloff's brilliance was not just academic. It was parasitic, drawing on something far older, something darker, that had long fed on the hidden veins of American life. Behind the facade of a scholar was a killer who hid his crimes in plain sight, protected by institutions that craved his knowledge even as they ignored the bodies that piled up around him. He lived between two worlds, the classroom and the grave. And if you listen closely, if you read the fragments he left behind, you'll hear whispers of something more than murder, something buried in seminaries, orphanages, and small towns along the Hudson River. Something we were never meant to name. The story of Edward Rulloff is not just about a man. It is about what happens when knowledge itself becomes a weapon, and when those who should protect us conspire to protect him instead. Tonight, we open the door they tried to keep shut, the door into his double life, brilliance and blood. Edward Rulloff's early years are recorded in fragments, the way a crime scene is remembered through stains and ash. Born in 1819 in New Brunswick, he quickly outpaced his peers, absorbing languages, philosophies, and sciences as though he had lived centuries before. Teachers called him unnatural, not in cruelty but in awe. His mind could cut through the structure of language like a scalpel, exposing the bones of human thought itself. But wherever brilliance appeared, blood was never far behind. In 1844, Rulloff's young wife and infant child vanished. Neighbors whispered she had fled his temper. Others claimed he had killed them in the dead of night, dragging their bodies into the marshes. No evidence was found, but when investigators entered his study, they discovered something stranger than absence. Notebooks filled with linguistic diagrams that resembled ritual symbols. Languages twisted into shapes that looked less like words and more like incantations. Yet the law hesitated. A man of genius could not be condemned without proof, and Rulloff, cold, articulate, and persuasive, spoke his way into freedom. The disappearance of his family was left unsolved. Institutions chose silence, just as they would again and again. Behind his acquittal was a deeper truth. His intellect gave him protection. Universities, libraries, and even local judges believed that his work could elevate mankind. His book, Method in the Formation of Language, was said to hold revolutionary insight. But some who saw the drafts claimed the pages were haunted, containing languages that had no history, alphabets that did not exist, and phrases that, once spoken, felt like prayers to something nameless. The scholar had blood on his hands, and yet society wanted him kept alive, because he knew things no one else dared to know. The authorities searched the marshes for Rulloff's wife and child, but they never found so much as a shoe buckle. Some whispered the soil itself had devoured them. Others believed he had used his linguistic experiments not just to study words, but to unmake flesh. The townspeople whispered about late night digging, about carts driven into the woods and returning empty. A local boy swore he saw Rulloff by the river with something wrapped in a quilt, the moonlight revealing a trail of dark liquid dripping into the water. But the boy's testimony was dismissed. Children, after all, imagine things. Yet something lingered. Dogs that approached Rulloff's property refused to go near the cellar. When the sheriff finally entered, he described an odor like burned parchment and rot. On the shelves, jars of fluid with tiny, unrecognizable fragments floating inside, too small to be identified but human in shape. The investigation ended without answers. Rulloff left the town soon after, vanishing into a haze of lecture halls and libraries, where his reputation as a criminal genius grew in tandem with his notoriety. The missing bodies became less of a legal concern and more of a local myth. To the law he was too clever to pin down, to the people he was a figure of dread. Mothers warned children not to stray near the river, lest the scholar catch them. And so the story of Edward Rulloff divided into two timelines, the official record of a brilliant linguist and the suppressed history of disappearances no one dared connect. But the truth, buried between those timelines, is far darker. His murders were not accidents, they were experiments, and they were only the beginning. As Rulloff drifted through New York State, he left behind more than manuscripts and whispers. He left behind absence. Villages recorded sudden spikes in missing persons, a seamstress vanishes, leaving a half-finished dress on her table, a child fails to return home from church, a farmer's family is found locked inside their own barn, suffocated, while Rulloff is seen in the distance, notebook in hand. But here is the true horror: the institutions did not stop him. Instead, they fed him. Seminaries invited him to lecture. Judges excused his transgressions, claiming genius should not be wasted. Newspapers wrote of his astonishing intellect, carefully omitting the bodies piling up in his shadow. And the orphanages, always the orphanages. Children with no families, no advocates, no voices. Rulloff was known to visit them, claiming to study how language first forms in the young. But the children he interviewed were not always seen again. And the ones who remained were not the same. Survivors would later whisper of a language lesson that left them unable to sleep, their mouths filled with words they did not recognize, words they swore were not English, not Latin, not anything human. In one report hidden deep in church archives, a priest describes a child who spoke in a tongue that made the walls weep. The priest demanded the boy be exorcised, but days later the child was gone and the record ends abruptly. This was the pattern: vanishings, corrupted speech, silent institutions. Rulloff harvested both bodies and voices. He was not just a killer. He was building something, constructing a cathedral of language where every missing soul became another brick. And America, desperate to believe in the promise of progress, let him keep building. Rulloff was arrested more than once: theft, fraud, suspicion of murder. And yet, each time the iron bars closed around him, the cell became a classroom. Guards reported hearing him lecturing to no one, his voice low, chanting syllables that bent into unfamiliar shapes. In 1857, during a prison term in Auburn, he wrote obsessively in a leather-bound manuscript he never allowed others to see. Fellow inmates claimed he drew diagrams on the stone walls, spirals, branching letters, what looked like maps of a world that didn't exist. At night, some swore they heard other voices answering him from the dark, though no one else was there. One inmate later confessed that Rulloff made him repeat the sacred syllables. Days after, the prisoner clawed his own tongue bloody, whispering, "It isn't mine anymore." The warden considered Rulloff dangerous but also valuable. Doctors, professors, and even ministers were brought in to observe him. His mind was a spectacle, his crimes dismissed as unfortunate byproducts of genius. His sentences were shortened, his punishments lightened. He walked out of Auburn with his manuscript intact, and a reputation as both criminal and savant. It was here that the double life truly solidified, a prisoner to the law but a prophet to institutions desperate to possess his knowledge. No one asked why he seemed healthier leaving prison than when he entered. No one questioned the missing inmates whose records were abruptly erased. Prisons are meant to contain evil. Instead, they became his laboratories. By the 1860s, Rulloff had found unlikely allies in places that should have condemned him most: churches. Parish records from Binghamton tell of his presence in a small Methodist congregation, not as a believer, but as a student of the divine order of language. He would sit in the pews, copying scripture in multiple languages, rearranging verses until they looked less like prayers and more like coded formulas. Congregants whispered that when he read aloud, the hymns felt distorted, as though each note carried an extra tone only animals could hear. Dogs howled, infants screamed. Yet the ministers did not expel him. They invited him into their libraries, let him access ancient texts, and quietly funded his studies. Why? Because Rulloff convinced them he was on the verge of uncovering the original tongue of Eden, the language Adam and Eve spoke before the fall. A language that could restore man's unity with God. But what the ministers didn't understand or refused to admit was that the Edenic tongue was not holy, it was corrosive. Parishioners who assisted him fell ill. A deacon's daughter began speaking at night in a guttural voice, claiming she heard Edward in her dreams. Another cut her own ears, saying she could not bear the sound of her own prayers any more. Still, the church kept silent. Knowledge, they believed, was worth the price. Souls could be saved later. For now, the man who murdered his family was being protected by men of God. In 1864, travelers along the Chenango River reported something strange. A village that had been there the year before, houses, a mill, a church, was simply gone, not burned, not abandoned, but erased. Foundations remained, but the families who lived there had disappeared without a trace. The locals whispered one name, Rulloff. He had been seen there months earlier, teaching the children. He claimed he was testing his linguistic theories by inventing a new alphabet for the school. Witnesses described him scratching symbols into slates and walls, symbols that children repeated with unnerving precision. Then silence. Within weeks, the entire settlement dissolved. No wagons fled, no graves appeared, no refugees arrived in neighboring towns. Just absence, a blank spot where life had been. Maps printed before 1864 still mark the place, but later editions omitted entirely, as though the town never existed. Historians dismissed it as a cartographic error. But there are letters, hidden in archives, written by desperate relatives searching for kin who had been swallowed whole. In one letter, a mother writes, "My boy learned the symbols and then he forgot English. He forgot me. One day he spoke a word and the air grew still. Then he was gone." It is here we begin to understand. Rulloff was not merely killing, he was subtracting, removing not just flesh but memory, language, history itself. The vanished town was never rebuilt. It was never spoken of again. As though language itself had conspired to forget. Among Rulloff's possessions seized during one of his arrests was a stone tablet, unlike anything catalogued in American archaeology. It bore an inscription in characters no one could identify, neither Greek, Hebrew, nor any known native dialect. He guarded it fiercely, claiming it was a Rosetta Stone of humanity, proof of an original universal tongue. Witnesses said he would place the tablet beneath his pillow at night. Guards swore his lips moved in sleep, repeating syllables that caused the glass in lanterns to tremble. One guard even claimed the stone answered, its letters faintly glowing in the dark. Scholars invited to examine it fell ill. One linguist cut short his study, insisting the symbols shifted under his gaze as if resisting interpretation. Another scholar disappeared weeks later. His journal contained only one entry, "The tongue speaks back." To the public, the tablet was dismissed as a fraud. To those who knew, it was an artifact of terrible consequence. Where had Rulloff found it? Some said it came from a burial mound along the Susquehanna River, others that he summoned it through ritual. Whatever its origin, the stone was more than an object. It was an infection, carried in language itself. When Rulloff was freed, the tablet vanished with him. It has never been recovered. Rulloff's obsession with teaching became another mask for his hunger. He would gather small groups of impressionable boys, orphans mostly, and instruct them in the universal grammar. Survivors later testified that the lessons were not lessons at all. They were invocations. The boys were made to chant phrases whose meanings they never understood. Hours would pass without rest, their voices growing hoarse as Rulloff prowled the room, correcting syllables with manic precision. Some fainted, others convulsed, and then came the dreams. Students reported waking in the night, hearing words written in fire across their ceilings. They saw Rulloff standing at the foot of their beds, though he was miles away. One orphan wrote, "He is not teaching us words, he is teaching words to us. They want to live inside." Children who endured the full course often broke. Some became mute, their voices locked inside forever. Others babbled ceaselessly, inventing alphabets on walls and dirt floors until their hands bled. The institutions that housed them, church schools, seminaries, orphanages, kept the truth buried. Reports of illness or breakdowns were attributed to feeble constitutions. But the children were not weak. They were vessels emptied out and filled again, and Rulloff, he was the hand that poured. By 1870, whispers and vanishings could no longer be ignored. That year, Rulloff participated in a burglary with 2 accomplices. During the robbery, a store clerk was killed. Unlike the vanishings, this crime was public, undeniable, witnessed. The accomplices fled. Rulloff was captured. For the first time, the law could not shield him. The genius, the linguist, the scholar, they were forced to admit he was also a murderer. But even here, the story fractures. The trial records mention only the burglary, the killing, and his long criminal history. What they omit is what was found in his satchel when he was arrested. Notebooks filled with unfinished alphabets, words arranged in spirals, and sketches of faces. Faces of people long vanished, drawn with inhuman accuracy. When asked about them, Rulloff only smiled. He told the court that his great work was nearly complete, that his death would not matter because the language is alive now. The jury sentenced him to hang. But those who attended the execution reported strange phenomena. Birds circling overhead in tight patterns, dogs howling in unison, children speaking in words they could not later recall. It was as if the language itself was mourning or celebrating. Edward Rulloff's body swung from the gallows in 1871, but the horror did not end there. Rulloff's execution should have ended his story, but instead it became its next chapter. His skull was taken by doctors at Cornell University, preserved in a jar, and placed on display as a specimen of criminal genius. Students studied it for decades. They measured its unusual size, its remarkable symmetry, convinced the secret of his brilliance lay in bone. But strange stories grew around the skull. Lectures given in its presence were plagued by flickering lights, by students fainting, by words misprinted in lecture notes, as though the language itself resisted accuracy. One night, a janitor swore he heard whispering from the jar. Another found papers rearranged on his desk into spirals identical to Rulloff's diagrams. But the most chilling accounts came from linguistics students. Those who stared too long at the skull claimed they began to dream in unfamiliar alphabets. They awoke with pages of notes they had no memory of writing. In some cases, handwriting matched Rulloff's. The skull remains at Cornell to this day, a relic both celebrated and feared. Officially, it represents a curiosity, the criminal mind under glass. Unofficially, it is the last surviving vessel of the language he tried to bring into the world. And some whisper that the language has not stopped speaking. After Rulloff's execution, the newspapers were eager to frame him as a cautionary tale, genius corrupted by crime. But hidden in private archives are testimonies that never made it to print. Testimonies too strange, too damning, too dangerous. One came from a prison chaplain. He swore that in Rulloff's final days, the condemned man refused confession, insisting he already spoke with the first voice of creation. The chaplain described their last conversation. His words were neither English nor any tongue I knew, yet I understood them. They told me what I had done as a boy. They knew my sins. I begged him to stop. Another testimony came from a young law clerk who transcribed the trial. Weeks after Rulloff's hanging, she was found in her room, her walls covered with writing. Not English, not any known script. Lines upon lines of alien letters scrawled in her own blood. Her final note read, "He is not gone. He is spelling himself through me." These accounts were buried, their existence denied. Institutions had no desire to admit that something survived him, something passed on through language itself. The official record claims his story ended in 1871, but the suppressed testimonies suggest otherwise. In 1932, during renovations of an abandoned orphanage in upstate New York, workers uncovered a hidden chamber behind a crumbling wall. Inside were decayed furniture, children's shoes, and one preserved object, a leather-bound diary signed only with the initials H.M. The diary belonged to a boy who had been one of Rulloff's students. The entries begin innocently, notes on lessons, drawings of letters, but soon the writing darkens. He describes words that made his teeth ache, phrases that made the walls vibrate. One entry reads, "He says words are doors. He says when I say them right, my mother will return. But when I tried, something else came instead. It sat in the corner all night and smiled without eyes." The final pages are written in symbols no scholar has been able to decipher. Some letters resemble those found on Rulloff's missing tablet. Others appear completely new. What chills researchers most is the handwriting. By the last entry, it no longer looks like a child's hand, but Rulloff's. The diary vanished soon after its discovery. Official reports claim it was misplaced, but whispers say it was seized by Cornell, locked away near the skull. At the turn of the 20th century, several seminaries quietly banned the study of Rulloff's unfinished manuscript, method in the formation of language. Professors caught lecturing from it were dismissed. Libraries purged it from their shelves. Why? Because the book was not merely a linguistic theory. It was a manual. Survivors of those classes reported that the text taught itself. Students would read passages aloud only to find themselves speaking words not printed on the page. Some chapters seemed to rearrange overnight, shifting into new forms. One seminary in Pennsylvania shut down entirely after a wave of breakdowns among students. Records suggest multiple suicides, one mass disappearance, and an incident where the chapel windows shattered simultaneously during a recitation. The church framed it as hysteria. But the silence of entire institutions, the way records were shredded, the way families were told nothing, all of it echoes the same pattern: protect the institution, bury the trauma. Rulloff had been dead for decades. Yet his voice still found new tongues. The skull drew endless fascination from the medical community. Craniologists, phrenologists, neurologists, all wanted to probe the head of the genius killer. But some who studied it paid a heavy price. In 1911, Dr. Thomas Wilder of Ithaca reportedly spent nights in his office, sketching the skull from every angle. His notes reveal a steady shift. Clinical descriptions give way to phrases like "he is speaking through the bone," and "I must finish his language." Within months, Wilder disappeared, leaving only reams of invented alphabets behind. Another physician claimed the skull emitted a faint hum when struck by light at certain angles. He died soon after in what was ruled a suicide, though his colleagues found his corpse surrounded by pages of symbols inked across his own skin. The doctors who listened too closely became vessels, continuing Rulloff's work against their will. And still, the skull remains on display, as though mocking those who believe it dormant. Decades after Rulloff's death, towns along the Hudson and Susquehanna continued to report strange vanishings. But local records show a disturbing trend. Official census documents altered, names erased, entire families reduced to blank entries. A courthouse clerk in Owego described his ledgers changing overnight. He swore that pages once filled with names now contained nothing but faint spirals, like words erased by an invisible hand. When he tried to copy the spirals, he found himself unable to stop, filling book after book until his hand broke in spasm. Later archivists quietly sealed those records, labeling them damaged. But the truth is simpler. The pattern of subtraction Rulloff began had not ended. Language itself was erasing the living. In the 1940s, a small circle of linguists attempted to reconstruct Rulloff's lost manuscript using fragments preserved in private collections. Within a year, 2 were dead, 1 institutionalized, and the rest vanished. Their notes, later recovered, reveal chilling consistency. Each scholar described the same dream, standing in a vast, dark library where books whispered without being opened. In every dream, Rulloff stood among the stacks, smiling, repeating, "Say it with me." One notebook ends abruptly with the words, "If language can create the world, it can uncreate it." The circle dissolved, the surviving families destroyed their notes, universities denied involvement. But in the private letters of one widow, there is a final warning: the language is not his. He only opened the door. Even into the 1950s, scattered reports surfaced of children speaking in tongues no one could place. In Elmira, a girl was expelled from school for scribbling strange alphabets on every surface. When asked what they meant, she said, "Mr. Edward taught me." She was only 7. In another case, a boy in Pennsylvania was found wandering after his entire family vanished. Questioned by police, he repeated one phrase over and over. The word took them. Psychologists dismissed these cases as delusions, the residue of folklore. But the recurrence of Rulloff's name decades after his death suggests something more chilling. His language had seeded itself in the mouths of the young, waiting, multiplying. These children grew up. They had children of their own. The infection was never contained. The skull of Edward Rulloff still rests in Cornell's collection. Officially, it is a specimen of phrenological interest. Unofficially, students whisper of its curse. They say that if you stare long enough into the hollow sockets, you'll dream in languages you've never heard. Some wake up muttering. Others find symbols carved into their desks that they do not remember etching. During one campus blackout in 1973, the display case was found shattered, but the skull lay untouched as though it had never moved. No one was punished. No one investigated. Today, the skull is hidden from public view, shown only on rare request. Cornell maintains it as a curiosity, a relic of a criminal past. But some professors admit privately the language is still alive inside. And every so often, a student leaves campus abruptly, their dorm room filled with spirals and phrases no one can read. Edward Rulloff was hanged in 1871. His crimes should have ended with him, but his legacy was not brilliance, nor was it blood. It was the marriage of the two, a parasitic language that survives by consuming those who speak it. Families, towns, churches, and institutions all conspired to protect him because they feared what he knew more than they feared what he did. And in protecting him, they ensured his work would live on. His genius was not a gift, it was a contagion. His murders were not random, they were sacrifices to a word older than humanity itself. And if history has done its work, you will not find his manuscript. You will not find the vanished town, you will not find the orphan's diary. They have been erased, subtracted, devoured, but you will find his skull. You will find the students who dreamed in his tongue. You will find the children still whispering phrases in playgrounds, words their parents cannot understand, because language is not dead ink on a page. Language breathes, language waits, and somewhere, even now, it is still spelling his name.